multi-stakeholder hearing in preparation for the high-level meeting of the General Assembly to review the global plan of action to combat trafficking in persons this coming November 22 and 23. I would like to briefly provide some background about this preparatory process and how this multi-stakeholder hearing fits in as a crucial component of the 2021 appraisal of the Global Plan of Action Against Trafficking in Persons. In January of this year, I was appointed by the President of the General Assembly to co-facilitate with Ambassador Imnadze, the Permanent Representative of Georgia, the resolution for the high-level meeting to review the modalities of the for the Global Plan of Action. I'm grateful to the member states who actively participated in the negotiations leading to the adoption of General Assembly Resolution 75/283. This multi-stakeholder hearing arises from the operative paragraph 11 of that resolution, which welcomed the contributions of member states, observers of the General Assembly, national human rights institutions, non-governmental organizations, civil society, academic institutions, and the private sector to the preparatory process for the high-level meeting in November. I'm honored to have been appointed by the President of the General Assembly as co-facilitator for the political declaration on trafficking in persons, and I thank him for entrusting also Ambassador Jose Blanco, the permanent representative of the Dominican Republic, and myself to help steer the next phase of intergovernmental negotiations on the political declaration expected to be adopted at the opening plenary of the high-level meeting. So today's multi-stakeholder hearing marks the beginning of the next phase of work over the coming months. Ambassador Blanco and I will convene a series of intergovernmental consultations with member states to negotiate the draft political declaration. But before that, today is a time to hear from member states, civil society organizations, the private sector, the academe, survivors, and other stakeholders as a key component of our preparations for the high-level meeting. All of you play a vital role in the fight against human trafficking through your work on the ground, your experiences, analysis of trends, collection of evidence, and support to victims. Effective partnership between relevant actors is a key element in combating human trafficking. A multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral, and comprehensive approach involving the whole of society is necessary in order to succeed in punishing the perpetrators of human trafficking. So I hope that discussions today will provide the member states engaged in formulating the political declaration with a much greater understanding of the challenges faced, as well as the promising practices identified by a range of stakeholders in addressing both the enduring and emerging issues on human trafficking. I would therefore like to thank all participants for their continued engagement and support for this very important process. Listening and learning from each other will help us in combating trafficking in persons and guide us towards a successful high-level meeting in November. I thank you very much.
I thank the permanent representative of the Philippines to the United Nations for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Jose Alfonso Blanco Conde, permanent representative of the Dominican Republic to the United Nations and co-facilitator of the political declaration on the implementation of the United Nations Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons, to make a statement. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, Executive Director of the UNDOC, High Commissioner of Refugees, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to the President of the General Assembly for tasking Ambassador Manalo and I such an important role in facilitating the intergovernmental negotiations on the political declaration expected to be adopted during the high-level meeting of the General Assembly on the appraisal of the United Nations Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons. Today, we have a meaningful opportunity to hear from member states, civil society, the private sector, academia, and other stakeholders actively engage in responding to trafficking in persons. I welcome the geographically diverse experts who will speak today and look forward to hearing about their efforts and recommendations to advance the anti-trafficking agenda. The UN Trafficking in Persons Protocol addressed the importance of member states cooperating with civil society in responding to trafficking in persons. Similarly, the UN Global Plan of Action to Combat Trafficking in Persons recognized the need to develop a global plan of action against trafficking in persons that will foster cooperation and coordination among all relevant stakeholders, including member states, international organizations, civil society organizations, and the private sector, and within various entities of the United Nations system, taking into account existing best practices and lessons learned. Despite considerable achievements and progress made in preventing and combating trafficking since the UN Trafficking Protocol and the Global Plan of Actions were adopted, as we will hear today, enduring issues and gaps in our response remain, such as the increase of sexual and gender violence, particularly in women and girls, trafficking for the purpose of forced labor, exploitation of technologies for trafficking, and the often undetected issue of trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. The impact of COVID-19 is also at the forefront of our minds. Over 2 decades on from the adoption of the Trafficking Protocol and 1 decade after we adopted this global plan of action, cooperation between state actors, civil society, academia, the private sector, and other stakeholders is more important than ever. Civil society organizations occupy a critical space in anti-trafficking responses, as they are often the first responders. Those who are on the ground identifying and providing essential protection services to victims of trafficking. This work is crucial in supporting victims in the immediate and long term and empowering them towards successful reintegration. Civil society actors also allow us to build trust and confidence with local communities, which is a vital component of combating trafficking in persons. Private sector actors can also play an important role in facilitating early intervention and prevention of trafficking, gathering information and intelligence, aiding investigation and prosecution of traffickers, as well as ensuring transparent supplies of change. Academics at the cutting edge of trafficking research can assist us in building our knowledge of trafficking in persons and developing evidence-based responses. The media also has an essential role to play in raising public awareness, exposing gaps and deficiencies in counter-trafficking actions, and helping us to develop improved and innovative solutions. It is thus incumbent on us, the member states, to work together to support, collaborate, and listen to all these actors. The exchange of thoughts and ideas between all relevant stakeholders during this multi-stakeholder hearing and going forward is vital in reflecting on the progress we have made as an international community tackling this crime, as well as the key issues we still need to prioritize in our anti-trafficking responses. I look forward to hearing the views of all participants today, which will no doubt assist in making the high-level meeting in November a big success. Madam Vice President, you can count on the Dominican Republic continued support always. Thank you very much.
I thank the permanent representative of the Dominican Republic to the United Nations for his statement. I now give the floor and invite Ms. Ghada Wali, Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, to make a statement. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to take part in this multi-stakeholder hearing to prepare the review of the Global Plan of Action Against Trafficking in Persons. I thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this event, and I congratulate the permanent representatives of the Dominican Republic and the Philippines on their appointment as co-facilitators. The world needs an inclusive, robust, and well-adapted action plan against one of the most enduring and exploitative forms of crime. Traffickers ruthlessly use people for profit, depriving victims of their rights as they deceive and coerce them into sexual exploitation, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation. Women and girls are disproportionately targeted, as are people in dire economic situations, including migrants, and the share of children among detected victims has tripled in the past 15 years. One rescued trafficking victim interviewed by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, an impoverished single mother, tricked into a life of horrific abuse, told us, "My trafficker has studied my vulnerabilities." The COVID-19 pandemic has increased the same vulnerabilities which traffickers feed upon. In 2020, extreme poverty was on the rise globally for the first time in more than 20 years. Women lost jobs at a greater rate than men. Some 1.6 billion children were affected by school closures. The effect of these drastic setbacks will increase the number of people at risk of exploitation by traffickers for years to come. At this critical time, UNODC remains committed to protecting people and supporting victims, leading to the UN system anti-trafficking responses. In 2020 alone, through our dedicated global program and network of field offices, we have provided technical assistance to 83 countries to help them implement the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. We support member states with drafting legislation, building national action plans, and training practitioners to ensure sustained impact. The Global Plan of Action, adopted in 2010, has been an important roadmap for our work. Our global report on trafficking in persons, mandated by the Plan of Action, provides policymakers and all of our partners in the fight against trafficking with the latest global data and trends, setting a foundation for victim-centered, age and gender-sensitive responses. UNODC also manages the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for victims of trafficking in persons, which was established by the Global Plan of Action. The Trust Fund assists 5,000 trafficking victims a year. UNODC's Blue Heart campaign against trafficking in persons supports the Trust Fund, and I'm pleased to see that the chair of the Trust Fund's board will deliver a statement at the closing session of this hearing and advocate for the campaign. Our office is also proud to coordinate the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons, which brings together 30 international organizations, enabling better coherence and synergies. With the review of the Global Plan of Action in November this year, we need to build on our common achievements while adapting our responses to new and enduring realities. Let me share with you 3 key points for your consideration as you prepare to write the next chapter in the global fight against trafficking. Firstly, traffickers have become experts at harnessing technology to identify, control, and exploit victims. We need to equip responders with the knowledge, skills, and software to tackle this threat and work closely with tech companies to detect and disrupt the use of technology by traffickers. Public-private partnership is needed to make progress on this front. Secondly, the pandemic has made it harder for victims to seek help and obtain justice. Last week, UNODC published a first-of-its-kind study showing that frontline organizations experienced funding and staffing shortages, and victims face challenges in accessing key services such as shelter, health services, and legal aid. Our study also identified success stories in countering these effects through the provision of services to victims online and the development of e-justice mechanisms. We need to use the lessons of this pandemic to ensure continuity of support for victims in future crises and help countries digitize their services. Thirdly, more needs to be done to promote the recognition of victims and avoid holding them accountable for the crimes of their exploiters. UNODC's analysis shows that traffickers deliberately use victims to shield themselves from prosecution, placing them in low-ranking roles within criminal hierarchies, and exposing them to detection by law enforcement as suspects and offenders. Countries should step up efforts to correctly identify victims of trafficking and refrain from punishing them, while facilitating access to remedies for those who have been unjustly penalized. In short, more support to victims is needed. Ladies and gentlemen, with their experience and insights, victims have a key role to play to prevent trafficking in persons, identify and support other victims, and bring perpetrators to justice. This year, the theme of our campaign for World Day Against Trafficking in Persons on July 30 is Victims' Voices Lead the Way. States and international organizations must listen to survivors, support victim-led initiatives, and integrate victims' voices into counter-trafficking responses. I very much welcome the participation of Ms. Itohan Okundai in this opening segment. I salute her courage and efforts to help so many victims break free from exploitation and abuse. I thank you once again for the opportunity to contribute to the review of the Global Plan of Action through this hearing, and I encourage you to let victims' voices guide your work towards the political declaration. Thank you.
I thank the Executive Director of the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime for her statement. I now invite His Excellency Mr. Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to make a statement. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, dear Ambassador, co-facilitators, Executive Director, colleagues. Ambassador, if you allow me, just a little thanks to colleagues from the Department of General Assembly and Conference Management for patiently accommodating all needs of everybody, even in this challenging technological situation. Really, I think they deserve some special thanks. Anyway, last year we marked the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Protocol on Trafficking in Persons, while of course we continue to measure implementation of the global plan of action to combat trafficking. In the past years, some important steps have been taken by states to combat trafficking, including through their support of the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which both, and this is important, both highlight the importance of protecting and supporting victims of trafficking. Yet, despite the strides made by states and the international community in combating this heinous crime and human rights violation, every year, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children continue to be forced or be deceived into situations of exploitation, which deprive them of their safety, of their liberty, and of their dignity. As the United Nations organization mandated to ensure protection for refugees and displaced people, my organization, UNHCR, sees counter-trafficking as a crucial and life-saving activity, which is core to the protection of human rights and addressing the needs of individuals at risk. It is about people, and we shouldn't forget that. People that I have met many times throughout my career with UNHCR. People that have been forced to endure the most horrific violence and deprivation, and who are often unable or afraid to ask for help. We cannot allow the scourge of human trafficking to continue, as it destroys lives and undermines everything that we as UN organizations stand for. For this reason, I was very happy to take up the role alongside UNODC as co-chair of the International Coordination Group Against Trafficking, what we call by the acronym of ICAT. In this capacity, we facilitate coordination among partners against trafficking. We're keen to use our large field presence to act as a bridge between the work of ICAT with the field operations where the needs are. Working through ICAT, we can collectively engage at multiple levels. Let me mention a few. First, by building the evidence base, helping us move from awareness to action. Second, by addressing the core drivers of trafficking, including reducing vulnerability. Third, by ensuring a rights-based approach through mechanisms that are really tailored to victims' needs. Fourth, and I think this is very important, by holding traffickers accountable and ending a very prevailing culture of impunity. Fifth, by discouraging demand. And sixth, by systematizing coordination and partnerships. And it is this last point that, as ICAT co-chair, I emphasize. We need to ensure that our efforts result in coherent and cohesive action. The fight against trafficking can only be won if we are unified and coordinated. All partners engaged in this effort, and it is significant to say this here today at this event, all partners engaged in this effort, states of course, but also regional organizations, United Nations entities, civil society, and supporters in the private sector, we are all jointly called to redouble our efforts and to end this phenomenon and ensure victims and survivors of trafficking regain their rights and their dignity. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
I thank you very much, High Commissioner for Refugees, for your statement and for your good work. I now give the floor to Ms. Etohan Okonde, survivor of trafficking for sexual exploitation of Nigeria. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Excellencies, Head of States, distinguished gentlemen, I'm very delighted to be here today in our midst. I'm standing here today to represent the voices of victims and survivors of trafficking of all forms. I am one single voice, and I stand here to represent those whose voices we do not hear, since they are silenced, objectified, abused, and treated as cattle. According to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Section 3, 4, 5, and 6, the United Nations stated that every person should be able to live in liberty and freedom, live in security, treated with respect, and should not be enslaved nor subjected to any kind of torture. Survivors of trafficking are key stakeholders in combating human trafficking. The inclusion of the experience and expertise of victims and survivors of trafficking is therefore highly beneficial for states, for anti-trafficking stakeholders, and unquestionably for victims and survivors, in order to include victims and survivors. The effort to make it centered around victims and survivors, the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights has established the International Survivors Advisory Council in January, in which I'm a member. In combating trafficking, it is important to include the voices, perspectives, and experience of victims and survivors in all anti-trafficking interventions, policies, and legislations. I was trafficked at the age of 15, molested, abused. My rights were taken away for 8 years. My question to this great assembly today is how many women, girls, children, and people are being trafficked right now as we speak, molested, abused, whose human rights are taken away, wishing someday someone will come to their rescue. With the pandemic, many more women, girls, and children are in more dangerous and vulnerable situations all around the world. Because the pandemic has left many homeless, has left many people very vulnerable. For food, clothes, shelter, many will not mind accepting the offers of traffickers for a better life promised by the traffickers. Not more than years ago, I was on the streets in Italy without hope for a future, without support. Many did not even survive. Many disappeared, never to be found. We need to start looking into long-term strategies to combat trafficking. Even after the COVID, there is an enormous need for education about human trafficking at every level and every sector of government. There are needs to review policies and legislations in order to identify victims, rescue, support, and help them reintegrate back into the society. And in order to give them opportunities to be heard and seen. I appeal to the General Assembly today to stand up for the Declaration of Human Rights, according to the UN Declaration in the Article 3, 4, 5, and 6. One enslaved person in the world is one too much. At this moment, there are approximately 40 million people trapped in different forms of human trafficking. I plead to us today to fight now. On every nation represented in this General Assembly, the crime we fail to fight today will become the giant we cannot defeat tomorrow. Let's rise up and join the fight. Every human being deserves freedom and dignity. No one is to be sold or enslaved. What are we going to do about this? Thank you, Excellency.
I thank you, Ms. Okonde, for your statement. As indicated in the program, this interactive multi-stakeholder hearing also consists of two panel discussions and a closing segment. The first panel discussion, entitled The Global Plan of Action and Enduring Trafficking Issues and Gaps, will be moderated by Ms. Yetna Getcho, Head of the Migrant Protection and Assistance Division at the International Organization for Migration, and will take place immediately following this opening segment. The second panel discussion, entitled The Global Plan of Action and Emerging Issues, will be moderated by Ms. Delphine Sanchez, a representative from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, New York Liaison Office, and will take place this afternoon from 3 p.m. to 4:50 p.m. The closing segment will take place immediately thereafter, moderated by Mr. Farouk Khan, Chef de Cabinet of the Office of the President of the General Assembly. The opening segment is now concluded. We will now begin the panel discussion, one entitled The Global Plan of Action and Enduring Trafficking Issues and Gaps. I warmly welcome Mr. Getcho to this meeting, along with the distinguished panelists. I now hand over the meeting to Mr. Getcho. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Can you hear me?
Mr. Moderator, we can hear you. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much. I do realize that we are half an hour or so behind time, and I would not go through the entire statement I have prepared for this, but I would like to say a few words by way of setting the scene for this first panel. Firstly, I wish to thank our last speaker at the opening session for her courageous and indispensable contribution to this process. We are reminded of why we are all here. I would also like to applaud the effort of the President of the General Assembly for holding this hearing. IOM is equally grateful for the work of the co-facilitators, the Republic of Philippines and the Dominican Republic. We have reached a number of very important milestones. First of which is we are now at 2 decades since the Palermo Protocol. It's been 10 years since the adoption of the Global Plan of Action. We've had a decade of global reporting on trafficking in persons, and we've seen a shift in 2015 from the Millennium Development Goals, none of which explicitly addressed human trafficking, to the Sustainable Development Goals, which do reference trafficking among several objectives. That said, we still are faced with quite a number of challenges that prove themselves as pervasive. Women and girls are still disproportionately affected by trafficking for sexual exploitation. We still purchase commodities that are produced through labor exploitation, be it worlds away or in our own backyards. And impunity remains high, though states have made great strides in anti-trafficking legislation and national action plans. At IOM, our notable anniversary is that we now have more than 25 years of counter-trafficking program implementation. With this long history, we recognize this enduring challenge. The last year has been particularly difficult. As has been mentioned several times, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced all of us to have a fresh look at how we fight trafficking. Amid the travel restrictions, lockdowns, and confinement measures, which sadly led to increasing vulnerabilities to violence, exploitation, and abuse, including human trafficking, we at IOM quickly adapted both in work modalities and in service delivery, employing innovative solutions. We are therefore very honored to be part of this discussion and are happy to contribute as a core operational partner, including through our strong relationship with governments, academia, private sector, civil society, and other partners as well. Out of our institutional and organizational approaches and beyond those, we have several opportunities that are available. We can make use of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which was adopted in 2008, and the subsequent creation of the UN Network on Migration. We are seized of the fact that the well-being and the perspectives of victims must remain at the center of counter-trafficking interventions. Though we often speak of survivor inclusion, we tend to stop short of long-term inclusivity and often limit involvement to offering testimonials. We must go beyond that. We advocate for investment in survivor-led initiatives and implore stakeholders to support leadership training for survivors who aspire to contribute to anti-trafficking work as a career, as we do here. On this occasion, we are granted a unique opportunity to learn from each other's experience and reinforce the motivation of our work. I am pleased to begin the discussion with our colleagues who have joined us here in this panel. We have 4 colleagues who are present. Let me quickly introduce each of them. First, Ms. Mariana Savic, Director of Athena in Serbia. Ms. Savic is a women's rights activist dedicated to direct support and long-term assistance to victims of trafficking and other forms of gender-based violence in Serbia. Her work with the non-governmental organization Athena has been recognized both nationally and globally through a number of awards. Second, Ms. Karolina Rudnik-Viskara. Ms. Rudnik-Viskara is the co-founder and executive director of Fundación Libera, a non-profit organization that seeks to prevent and combat human trafficking in Chile and Latin America. She is a professor of political and constitutional law at the Universidad del Desarrollo and is a certified ontological coach. We also have Ms. Rezuena Osman, who is the Executive Secretary of the Malawi Human Rights Commission. She contributed to the enactment and advocacy of several gender-related laws and gender policies, including the 2015 Trafficking in Persons Act as Special Law Commissioner. And finally, Dr. Marika McAdam as an independent international law and policy advisor. She has worked on counter-trafficking issues globally, including with UNODC, IOM, OHCHR, Chatham House, Nexus Institute, and several others. She advises practitioners, policymakers, others on migrant smuggling, human trafficking, human rights, and their intersection. I now would like to address Ms. Savic, founder and director of the Citizens Association for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings and All Forms of Gender-Based Violence, Athena. I would like to pose a question for you. The 2020 UNODC Global Report on Trafficking in Persons reports that half of the cases that are detected are of sexual exploitation. And of those, when we look into the details, almost 4 out of 5 victims are women and girls. A whopping 72% happen to be girl victims of trafficking. The question for you then is, why do you think trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation remains such a pervasive crime? And can you please tell us about Athena's efforts to combat it? You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. Those statistics show to us that trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation is a quintessential violence against girls and women. The reason for that lies in unequal relations of power, deeply rooted patriarchy, poverty, discrimination, and exclusion of women in all the important segments of society: decision-making, finance, leadership, you name it. This is not hearsay, it's a fact that women in all countries of the world are unequal to men. Some societies are simply more aware of it and emphasize it publicly and more frequently than others. The fact is also that societies are not gender neutral, and that we finally have to recognize those structural problems that lead to trafficking of women and girls. We have to be more honest and to stop hiding behind prejudice and stereotypes. We have to call things the name that they deserve, and it is the only way to move forward. In the experience of NGO Athena, trafficking is perceived only as a security and a criminal justice issue. This brings some attention to the governments and to the law enforcement judicial bodies. However, it is a social justice issue, and when it is perceived as such, then there are no effective responses for the authorities. If we do not change that soon, we are leaving behind millions of women and girls without the possibility to exit these exploitative situations and without any possibility to receive support and justice. We have to listen to girls and women, we have to trust them, and if we believe them only when we have all the other evidence for the court proceeding, we will never be able to eliminate violence. We have to stop talking about how trafficking can happen to everyone. From the position of NGO Athena, we know that generalizations are very dangerous and they can lead us to wrong conclusions. Of course, a lot of people could be at risk of being sexually exploited. But in reality, it happens to girls and women who are already deprived and living on the margins of the society. When you talk to them, when you look at them, you will see stories behind them that they were already abused within their communities, within their families, and you will see the systems that failed to protect and support them. They were deprived from education system, for example, if they are girls. All that is the main mission of NGO Athena for 18 years, to support women and girls survivors of trafficking in Serbia, to take the initiative, to claim their rights and become activists who fuel the power of the change. And thank you for your activism also, Okundaya.
Thank you very much, Ms. Savic. Well, following up on what you've said, what are the messages you would like to see reflected in the political declaration then?
Well, if
you
we
have
want to
about
be,
2 minutes.
Yes. If we want to be more effective in our work, we have to use intersectional gender lens to understand how these multiple factors of advantage and disadvantage, race, sex, gender, sexuality, religion intersect in the context of trafficking. We need to improve access to support and justice, especially for minor victims of exploitation and human trafficking. The rights and access to justice for victims of trafficking, particularly for women and girls, cannot be selective. We see in many cases that criminal acts of trafficking are being requalified and prosecuted as more easily provable acts. With this, we are sending the wrong message both to victims and traffickers. To victims, that there is no justice for them. To traffickers, they did not commit such grave crime and they can repeat it. This has to be stopped. Bearing in mind that surviving exploitation leaves severe and sometimes life-lasting consequences, human trafficking must be recognized as a crime against humanity and flagrant violation of human rights. In this moment, migration is an important topic. Governments must recognize human trafficking as a sufficient grounds for seeking asylum and ensure that refugee and migrant women and girls who are the victims obtain asylum protection. Identification process of victims has to include not just justice system, law enforcement, state institution. It has to include civil society organizations with relevant knowledge and competence, especially women's organizations that lead the fight and are always ahead of state services in providing women and girls what they need actually. Implementation and financing of coordinated women and girl-centered, accessible, comprehensive, long-term services to survivors has to be scaled up. States should also consider data across gender studies and build closer and trustful ties with women's and community organizations, especially those who are working directly with women and girls at risk of sexual exploitation. There has to be decriminalization and depenalization of women in prostitution over the globe. Preventive measures are a must, especially to affect demand side and suppress sexual abuse and violence that lead to sexual exploitation. School curricula should incorporate sex education, and those early warning signals within the school education system, social protection institutions, in health system must be in synergy. Fighting violence has to be recognized by all the system. There must be an enhancement of implementation, evidence-based prevention strategies by institutions to women organizations in order to decrease the prevalence of sexual exploitation of women and girls. But before, so just one more sentence. But before and after all this, we need to build trust. Trusting victims about their experience is essential. Governments trusting NGOs and citizens could prevent many more problems in the future. Trust us, trust the survivor. This is a must. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ms. Savic. Very important, concrete, and clear points. I really appreciate that. Let me turn my attention to the second panelist, Ms. Carolina Rudnik-Vizcarra, founder and director of Liberia Foundation in Chile. Ms. Vizcarra, globally, countries are detecting and reporting more victims of trafficking in persons for forced labor and are convicting more labor traffickers. This is also a form of trafficking, particularly affecting males, with 67% of detected men victims and 66% of boy victims trafficked for forced labor. However, the existence of a comprehensive international legal framework and significant attention being paid to address this form of trafficking still persists. What is the Libera Foundation doing to tackle labor trafficking, particularly of men? Over to you. 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Getachew, and my kind regards and hellos to all excellencies, heads of state, distinguished panelists and attendees. It's an honor to be here sharing our thoughts and visions. Regarding your question, when the global estimates speak of 40 million people in contemporary slavery, 25 million in forced labor, and we contrast it with the victims detected according to the 2020 United Nations Global Report, which only comprises 1 or 2% of that amount, the inefficiency of the system is evident. From Livera, we propose a fundamental change in the understanding and view of the phenomenon that requires recognizing that the ineffectiveness of the current system is fundamentally an ethical problem, not a legal one. Slavery is the radical rupture of commutative justice that must govern every private relationship between individuals, all mutual giving and receiving between private citizens, the only condition that ensures the freedom and equality of individuals in their capacities as fellow citizens, as peers. Slavery takes the forms of violations of rights using the form of radically unfair exchanges. And as a violation of rights in exchanges between individuals, slavery is not a unique and absolute notion. It admits multiple forms and degrees which correspond to the multiple forms of exploitation contemplated both by the crime of human trafficking and other autonomous figures such as forced labor or child sexual exploitation. Like all principles of justice, we must remember it restores a balance that is necessary for life and for human life. And like any principle of justice, it is a moral truth that it is only fully apprehended from emotion, because justice is a human experience, is an emotion. Trafficking for forced labor of the Palermo Protocol is a form of slavery, and as a form of slavery, it includes the characteristic notes of this institution when it existed legally and which currently corresponds to the material experience of those who suffer it: unlimited subordination, legal and institutional incapacity. They're not taking decisions about their lives. They're not being regarded as equal. In Latin America, we encounter patterns that repeat in other regions of the world. In agriculture, in construction, in fishing industry, in the textile industry, and the domestic service employ undocumented regional migrants, poor women, indigenous people, and children under conditions of forced labor. In the fields, on construction sites, and in restaurants and private facilities, workers live in terrible sanitary conditions, no access to water and without access to food or scarce food. They're recruited through formal and informal contractors subject to little state supervision, who threaten them with the loss of their immigration status or outright deportation to achieve non-resistance to their demands, which include excessive hours, no overtime pay, difficult and dangerous working conditions, abuse and discrimination, degrading living conditions, withholding of wages, illegitimate deductions and non-payment of overtime, which has increased in the pandemic, restriction to access to resources and retaliation, restriction of movement and isolation, sexual harassment, and psychological and physical violence.
Ms. Vizcarra,
yes?
With apologies for interrupting you, it really is a very grim picture. But the question is then, how do we make faster and more comprehensive progress in tackling this form of trafficking?
In doing that, we need to understand that the massiveness of the notes of subordination and legal and institutional incapacity that we observe in the situation of trafficking for forced labor is not isolated, sporadic, episodic cases of violence, but it's rather a structural situation and a social and cultural phenomenon rooted in customs and mentalities in all parts of the world based on a culture of violence and discrimination funded in a fictitious category of inferiority. What do we need to do facing the revision of the Global Plan of Action? We must reconquer the original meaning of words that are present in our ethical legal principles. And trafficking for forced labor is essentially a matter of human rights, of social justice, and only after that a problem of criminal nature. We need to understand that the trafficking for purpose of forced labor captures the same material content as the old slave trade. The trade in human beings through the suppression of rights that prevents a worker from offering resistance to labor demanded by force, physically or psychological. Forced labor, trafficking for forced labor cannot be fully understood unless we take into consideration the globalized economy made up of global value chains that have outsourced the labor that produces goods and services in poor countries with low institutionality for the benefit of rich countries, or that they have benefited directly or indirectly from forced migration driven by globalization of poverty and a regional political and economic conflict, such as the Venezuelan exodus in our region. We need to recognize that human trafficking is occurring in the licit legal economy, and therefore the role of private sector is key, and its legal responsibility in prevention, mitigation, and remediation must be established imperatively. We need to incorporate the new paradigms that the current evolutionary crossroad challenges us. We depend on each other. We need each other. We need to advance from the patriarchal paradigm of understanding each other as single beings, isolated, separated from one another, and recognize we're interconnected and interdependent system, locally, nationally, and globally. Just two things to end. Multidisciplinarity, multidimensionality in the way the justice system addresses the issue. We need a dialogue between knowledges. We need a dialogue between actors.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Vizcarra. That was very clear, and really appreciate the passion you've put into presenting those recommendations. Let me turn to our next panelist, Ms. Habiba Osman, Executive Secretary of the Malawi Human Rights Commission. Ms. Osman, impunity of traffickers remains widespread after so many efforts and so many years of investment. Why do you think this is, and what can we do about it? Ms. Osman? I believe we have connection issues. Perhaps,
Mr. Moderator, we are troubleshooting, but we seem to be unable to give the floor to Ms. Osman.
Excellent. Can we then move on to Dr. Marika McAdam? Dr. McAdam, if you can hear me, as I mentioned earlier, she is International Legal and Policy Advisor, specialized in counter human trafficking and migrant smuggling. The question to you, Doctor, is what do we really know about trafficking in persons? And what are the challenges in building an evidence base that moves beyond assumptions, biases, and static snapshots? Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Getachew, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the question. Look, I think we've made some progress in painting a picture of human trafficking. We have the UNODC Global Report, which digs deeper with every issue. We have the IOM-led counter-trafficking data collaborative, which draws on real case data sets. We have the US State Department Trafficking Report, which is arguably even more influential than these others for the financial implications of its tier ranking system. But invaluable though these resources are, all, I think, mirror the challenges of evidence gathering more broadly in trafficking. Significantly, they're limited by state capacity to gather data, which is uneven across the globe. And furthermore, much of the data that is collected is informed by domestic, legal, political, and policy agendas, rather than being an explicit service to international commitments. Added to this too, we also have parallel investments being made in attempts to quantify forced labor and the rubbery concepts of contemporary and modern slavery, which is all valuable in its way, but of uncertain utility for on-the-ground criminal justice response to trafficking. So, as you said earlier, we have had an international definition of human trafficking for 20 years, but have we yet reached an international understanding? And in my view, we still have confusion persisting about what trafficking is and isn't, including relating to the interplay between its constituent elements, the threshold of severity required to constitute exploitation, and indeed what forms it takes. And incredibly too, sir, human trafficking and migrant smuggling continue to be conflated, both in ignorance and sometimes by design to serve divergent policy and political agendas. So we are not yet really in sync about what we're actually building an evidence base on, and in my view, to avoid further drifting away from international commitments, we need to look at this and acknowledge the risks and the limitations inherent in attempts to quantify very complex human experiences. We also need to build evidence-gathering capacity and resilience to external agendas and biases, and we need, of course, to be constantly interrogating who's building this evidence base, with what methodology, with what agenda, and critically to what end, because evidence is only valuable if it can be acted on.
Absolutely. But the current evidence itself, what does it say about our current responses to counter-trafficking?
Well, I mean, as we've heard, the criminal justice response to trafficking is widely and very fairly, I think, criticised, but we have to ask what we really know about it. And I think in looking at the evidence on response, it's striking that we're actually yet to arrive at consensus on what successful counter-trafficking response looks like. For instance, the metrics that are often used might flag the number of police and prosecutors and judges who are trained, but not speak to what they actually did with what they learnt. We also hear about conviction rates, but we don't hear whether those convictions actually resulted in disruption of trafficking routes or dismantled organised crime groups. And it's easy for us to find out how many victims received assistance services, but we don't yet really know whether they actually wanted those services or indeed benefited from them. So we have evidence of response, but less evidence of results, whether positive or negative. And I think that this is really a call to revisit how we are measuring what we are doing. And donors, I think, have a really critical role to play here, because recipients, understandably, are very reluctant in pushing back on what they're being funded to do, meaning that the onus shifts on donors to invest in and to listen to evidence about what works and what doesn't, and to empower recipients of funding to actually go out and make mistakes to generate evidence of that distinction. And donors, I think, too, have a responsibility to assess the return on their investment in line with international commitments. For instance, there's been a historical trend of shelters being an attractive brick-and-mortar investment, but have donors incentivized rights-based open shelter models, or have they inadvertently incentivized prolonged shelter stays for victims who don't want to be in those shelters? There's also a push now for research, importantly, to capture victim voices, but are donors also supporting that research to be ethical and impactful? And in funding development for counter-trafficking tools, of which there are so very many, are donors building in sufficient time and money for the uptake and implementation of those tools, or are they considering the job done when they see their logo on a glossy document? So in short, I think, Mr. Getachew, we need to arrive at a clear consensus about what constitutes effective counter-trafficking response. And importantly, it has to be guided by and measured against the positive obligations that are set out in international law and indeed are confirmed by the Global Plan of Action.
Thank you very much. If I get you, then we need to move beyond counting outputs and we need to focus on outcomes of the work that we do. Thank you. May I check if we have Ms. Habiba back online? If not, we could proceed.
Apologies, Mr. Moderator. Not yet.
Not yet. Very well. At this stage, then, I would now like to open the floor for comments and questions. I would like to say a few words in regards to technicalities. Participants will not be able to unmute their microphones or activate their video unless given the floor. When called upon to speak, the participant will receive a message saying that their streaming is approved. Please press the video button appearing in that message in order to share your video and audio. I will do my best to announce 2 or 3 upcoming speakers at a time. After I do so, I request those announced speakers, and only those, to click the hand icon to enable the Secretariat to locate you among the participants. Speakers from civil society organizations will be interspersed among member states. If you face audio or video issues during the meeting, please use the restart all lines button above the hand icon. Should the problem persist, please reload your browser. Before proceeding further, I would like to request all participants to kindly turn off their microphones when they are not speaking in order to ensure an orderly discussion. Participants are reminded that interventions should be limited to a maximum of 3 minutes. I thank you for your cooperation. In your interventions, I would encourage you to share any recommendations you may have for member states who will soon be embarking on the intergovernmental negotiations on the political declaration as part of the 2021 Global Plan of Action Against Trafficking in Persons appraisal process. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Belarus on behalf of the group of Friends United Against Human Trafficking, followed by Ms. Sisi Matekaere, Global Lead, End Sex Trafficking Equality Now. Over to you, Honorable Representative of the Republic of Belarus.
Mr. Moderator, Belarus got disconnected.
Oh, my regrets. Could we perhaps then call on Ms. Sisi Matekaere, Global Lead, End Sex Trafficking Equality Now, followed by Ms. Taani Bien Aim, Executive Director, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Ms. Matekaere.
Thank you, Your Excellencies and distinguished guests. Equality Now is an international human rights organization with partners and members in almost every country, and we are also a founding member of the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights. Women and girls continue to be the most affected by human trafficking, with the majority of them trafficked for sexual exploitation. Systemic sex and gender-based discrimination and inequality creates economic and social injustice, which is experienced disproportionately by women and girls, and in turn increases their vulnerability to trafficking and exploitation. So as we are moving forward with the Global Plan of Action, we call on member states to review and amend their sex and gender discriminatory laws and put in place clear constitutional and other guarantees of equality and non-discrimination and the rule of law as a key priority in addressing the root causes of trafficking in women and girls. The COVID pandemic has exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, pushing women and girls further into poverty and marginalization. And at the same time, we see that traffickers have adapted their business model and human trafficking is moving to the digital space, and increasingly women and girls are trafficked online for sexual exploitation and forced marriage. So we really believe that it is critical for governments to ensure the rule of law in the digital space, and that states must enact and enforce protective and preventative measures to address online trafficking for sexual exploitation. We would call on member states and others to work together to develop and adopt international standards that will provide a guiding framework for international cooperation and the enactment of more robust national laws that will address the gendered and multi-jurisdictional nature of online trafficking for sexual exploitation. We also see that the COVID pandemic has exposed the limited protection and support available for trafficked persons, and services such as psychosocial support, access to state benefits are inadequate, and many survivors are failing to access justice. If there had been better protection for trafficked persons, effective prosecutions to end impunity of traffickers, and measures to address the demand that fosters trafficking, then the ongoing effects of the pandemic on trafficking would have been less catastrophic for women and girls. Therefore, in rebuilding, we would urge all member states to develop and implement holistic anti-trafficking laws and other measures that really look at prevention, prosecution, and protection in accordance with international laws and standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Matekaere. Next would be Ms. Taina Ben Aim followed by the representative of the European Union, who then would be followed by Ms. Maria Emilia Cebrian, Program Officer for Latin America Global Alliance Against Traffic in Women. So over to you, Ms. Bian Ain.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, for giving me the floor virtually. Excellency, distinguished delegates, on behalf of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, or CATW, I welcome the opportunity. I'm hearing, do you hear an echo? I apologize. May I reclaim my...
Please proceed. I think it's okay.
Okay. On behalf of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, or CATW, I welcome the opportunity to present the following few points in light of the upcoming appraisal of the implementation of the Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking activities. CATW is one of the oldest international organizations dedicated to ending the trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and girls worldwide as a form of gender-based violence and discrimination. As members of civil society, we appreciate the challenges member states face in combating trafficking.
Forgive me for interrupting you. If you have another device on, would you mind switching it off? With apologies.
I don't have another device.
Okay. Please proceed. We will see how. Thank you.
Amid the global COVID-19 pandemic that is still ravaging nations and taking too many lives, the challenges to combat human trafficking have increased in ways that have not yet been assessed or calculated. In spite or because of the global economic and health crisis, it is also an opportunity for member states to affirm the tenets of the Global Plan of Action that will promote a human rights-based and gender-sensitive approach in addressing factors that create vulnerabilities to human trafficking. In a brief published in 2020, UNODC reported on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on organized crime infiltration in both the legal economy and illegal governance. Trafficking in persons is listed as one of the most severe human and economic damage these criminal activities caused around the world. Every day we hear from our partners around the globe who report exponential increases in sexual violence, online child abuse and exploitation, trafficking in girls and women, and girl marriage being a form of sex trafficking by the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking. Each of these human rights violations is paralleled with a precipitous decline in services to victims, access to justice, and investments in prevention. As countries reopen their economy, we exhort member states to reflect on the commitments made to ensuring the full implementation of the Global Plan of Action. In its political declaration, we urge member states, 1, to recall the provisions of international conventions, in particular the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. 2, to incorporate the language and goals of SDG Target 5.2 and to invest in gender-specific approaches that tackle sexual violence, the exploitation of prostitution, and sex trafficking. 3, to invest in discouraging the demand that fosters exploitation under Article 9.5 of the Palermo Protocol. And 4, to call upon survivor-led efforts and its leaders as key stakeholders in combating trafficking and supporting its victims. As members of civil society, we welcome partnership with member states to engage in multi-stakeholder collaboration to fully implement the Global Plan of Action wherever trafficking occurs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. May I call on the representative of the European Union next, please?
Good morning, good afternoon. Depends where you are on the side of the Atlantic. Thank you very much, Mr. Gatashev, for giving me the floor, Your Excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here today and to intervene in this important hearing. In the European Union, every year trafficking in human beings endangers thousands of individuals, and traffickers prey on social and economic inequalities and vulnerability of people. And as several participants underlined today, this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Combating trafficking in human beings is and has been a priority of the European Union, and there has been some progress in many respects. But as mentioned also before, the crime remains a serious threat. The majority of the victims are women and girls trafficked for sexual exploitation, and almost every fourth victim is a child. Half of the victims are EU citizens, many trafficked within their own state. Victims are also identified in mixed migration flows, with women and children being at particular risk of being trafficked along migration routes. Demand for labor exploitation remains extremely high. Moreover, traffickers moved to a business model of online recruitment and exploitation of victims, making it more difficult for law enforcement and judiciary to respond. Trafficking must be seen in an integrated, in a holistic, in a human right and victim-centered and gender child-sensitive approach. To address these challenges, the European Commission presented in April this year the EU strategy on combating trafficking in human beings for 2021 until 2025. It addresses trafficking in a comprehensive way, from the prevention to the conviction of criminals, while emphasizing the protection of victims at all stages. The strategy lays down priorities to reduce the demand that fosters the crime, to break the criminal business model of traffickers both offline and online, to protect, support and empower the victims, especially women and children, and focuses on the international dimension at the same time. In this context, ladies and gentlemen, civil society organizations play a very, very important role. The European Commission already works closely with the EU Civil Society Platform Against Trafficking in Human Beings, which gathers nearly 100 NGOs from EU and non-EU countries. The role of civil society is crucial in policy making and on the ground. It is crucial in identifying victims at an early stage and in providing them with assistance, support and protection. That's also why I'm very pleased to be here today and to be in a position to listen to all the intervention we have, including in this panel. Trafficking in human beings is a transnational and global phenomenon, and EU priorities fully apply in the context of the EU external policies. The EU has acceded to the Palermo Protocol, and the Commission supports the EU member states and non-EU partner countries in the implementation of this instrument, including in the context of the recently launched review mechanism. We will pursue closer cooperation with all relevant actors at international level, and especially with EU agencies. On multilateral work, including as part of the implementation of the global plan of action, it is critical in this respect. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, we really welcome today's hearing, which will help to advance the anti-trafficking agenda. But not only the anti-trafficking agenda at global level, I'm also sure that the hearing will be extremely important for us at EU level in the context of the implementation of the EU strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Schmidt. Much appreciated. Next, we will give the floor to Ms. Cebrian, as mentioned earlier. Following her, it will be Mr. Daniel Celesclaf, Director of the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative. After him, the representative of Australia on behalf of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and then Ms. Alison Boak, Director, the Global Center on Human Trafficking, Montclair State University in the U.S. So over to you, Ms. Cebrian.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women welcomes the recognition by state parties of human trafficking as a serious crime and a human rights violation, and their commitment to addressing trafficking through the Global Plan of Action. In the past 2 decades, almost every country in the world has introduced legal mechanisms and practical measures to address human trafficking. Yet, we are very far from ending trafficking and exploitation. Therefore, it is imperative for us all now to reflect on the challenges in this work and broaden the scope of anti-trafficking measures. GetW's research shows that precarity and exploitation are the common threads that bind low-wage workers around the world today. Despite the existence of anti-trafficking laws, millions of workers enter into exploitative arrangements because they have no better options. Therefore, we urge states to shift focus to the root causes of human trafficking and to see it as a result of structural socioeconomic issues related to gender, migration, labor, development, and economic policies. GetW is deeply concerned about some measures taken in the name of anti-trafficking, including stricter border controls, tighter visa regimes, policing of low-income and migrant communities, raids on sex work establishments, detention and deportation of suspected victims. Such measures must stop. Research shows that the pandemic has exacerbated human trafficking. This should not surprise us because job loss, wage theft, and job insecurity have increased multifold. We urge states to broaden their trafficking prevention initiatives to include affirmative action steps and protect the rights of low-wage workers in their territories, regardless of their migration status. Further, anti-trafficking measures must be complemented by protection of labor rights and civil and political rights. To prevent and combat human trafficking, states must adhere to the International Human Rights Framework, including the SDGs, and ensure access to justice and long-term support to survivors of trafficking, ensure access to public services and social protections for all, end gender-based violence and discrimination, and ensure women's full and equal participation in public and political life. Ensure decent work for all, including a living wage and freedom of association. Reduce income inequality within and between countries. Ensure access to education and skills in order to enable decent employment for all. Prevent, mitigate, and manage the impact of climate change, and ratify Conventions 189 and 190 of the ILO and take all necessary steps to implement them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cebrian. May I give the floor to Mr. Daniel Selesclaf, Director of the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, thank you for giving me the floor, and many thanks to the panelists for their insightful remarks on enduring trafficking issues. I will focus my brief intervention on the importance of partnering with the private sector, especially the financial sector, in identifying human trafficking risks in value chains and ensuring the proper tools and resources are available to most effectively and collaboratively work towards eradicating these abuses. Financial institutions may be connected to human trafficking through their own operations or through their business relationships. Because the financial sector is so intertwined with the rest of the economy, financial sector action is essential for combating these crimes. In response to multilateral calls to partner with the private sector in tackling modern slavery and human trafficking, Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, or FAST, also known as the Liechtenstein Initiative, was founded as a multi-stakeholder initiative based at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. It is supported by the governments of Liechtenstein, Australia and the Netherlands, and the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, as well as private and philanthropic partners. The FAST Blueprint, the culmination of a year-long global consultation by an expert commission, provides a shared collective action framework that outlines 5 goals and 30 actions for the entire financial sector and its stakeholders, including governments, regulators, and the multilateral system. FAST now works to mobilize the financial sector around the world, working with banks, investors, survivor support organizations, regulators and policymakers to implement the blueprint. Grounding our work in evidence-based approaches and rigorous analysis, FAST provides tools to the financial sector to take meaningful, sustained action in this area. As traffickers are continuously finding alternative ways to launder illicit funds, it is essential that these tools keep up with new developments on the ground. We must work in partnership to ensure that typologies and regulations quickly adapt to these changes in order to detect and disrupt human trafficking networks. The financial sector has a unique opportunity to lead the transformation of our global economy. The Global Plan of Action to Combat Trafficking in Persons should therefore consider best practices of working with the financial sector in order to meet our shared ambitions of ending human trafficking by 2030. FAST is available to assist with that effort. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. I now move on to the representative of Australia on behalf of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Thank you very much, Chair. And on behalf of CANZ, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, I'd like to thank the President of the General Assembly for providing the widest possible participation in today's event. And in this regard, I'll keep my remarks brief so as not to distract from the statements of civil society, national human rights institutions, and non-governmental stakeholders. They are often at the front lines of combating trafficking in persons on the ground, and their insights are more important than ever with the severe health and economic impacts of COVID on at-risk populations worldwide, including victims and survivors of trafficking in persons and slavery. They provide on-the-ground context, experience working with communities, and expertise in building the capacity of stakeholders working to stop these crimes. Trafficking in persons is both a violation of international human rights law and criminal law, with the ability to destabilise communities as well as threaten peace and security and development. We are all of the view that a human rights-based, gender and age-responsive, survivor-centred and trauma-informed approach to combating trafficking in persons can ensure a lot of things. That legislation and policy aimed at combating trafficking does not infringe upon other human rights, that factors that increase vulnerability to trafficking are identified, such as racism, poverty, sexual exploitation of women and girls, exploitation of migrant workers, and discrimination, among others. That victims and survivors of trafficking in persons are protected, supported, have access to essential services, and are not re-traumatised or re-victimised by our own actions. And that criminal justice processes are enhanced through greater support for victims and survivors to participate in policy development and cooperate in the prosecution of traffickers. We will work to ensure that the appraisal of the Global Plan of Action underlines, as I say, a rights-based, gender and age-responsive, survivor-centred and trauma-informed approach which leverages multi-stakeholder partnerships to combat trafficking in persons in response to today's realities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Much appreciated. Miss Alison Brock, floor is yours. If I may ask all speakers to try and speak quickly perhaps confine their remarks to 2.5 minutes, as we will have the facilities switched off at 12:20. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ali Boak. I'm the director of the Global Center on Human Trafficking, headquartered at Montclair State University. We are a multidisciplinary effort focused on developing innovative solutions to the global problem of human trafficking. I'd like to begin my remarks by highlighting the need for all actors, whether they be from government, law enforcement, civil society, academia, or the private sector, to work according to a human rights approach. This approach requires us all to consider at each and every stage the impact that a law, policy, practice, or measure may have on persons who've been trafficked and persons who are vulnerable to being trafficked. To effectively respond to the crime of human trafficking while protecting the rights of survivors, the field must move to engage and support survivors as leaders and as equal partners. We must challenge ourselves to move even further than a victim-centered approach, and we must learn from, listen to, and build our responses based on the lived experience of survivors of all forms of human trafficking. The third appraisal of the Global Plan of Action can increase our knowledge of human trafficking and revolutionize the way we all respond to human trafficking by elevating and supporting the role, leadership of survivors in developing anti-trafficking interventions. If we are to improve our response from prevention to protection through prosecution, we must focus on our partnership with survivors in all areas, especially in the area of research. It is through a better understanding of the phenomena of human trafficking that we will be able to innovate new, more effective responses. A global research agenda should be developed that is driven by survivors and engages survivors in all aspects of the research. Further qualitative and quantitative study by and of survivors is necessary at the micro and macro level. We need to reduce our reliance on small, unrepresentative samples and end the practice of developing interventions based on extrapolations from small, convenient samples. Research must be increased in areas of the world with the highest prevalence of human trafficking. International research collaborations must be funded and supported. The only way to truly increase our knowledge is to support and engage survivors as researchers, interviewers, data collectors, and data analysts. The Global Center on Human Trafficking urges the third appraisal of the Global Action Plan to highlight the large gap in research conceived and carried out by survivors and to call for funding, international collaboration, and support for survivor-driven and executed research projects. Thank you very much for your time and for considering my comments today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boak, and my apologies for mispronouncing your name.
That was perfect. Thank you.
The next three speakers will be Ms. Madeleine Garlick, Head of Protection Policy and Law Section of the Division of International Protection from UNHCR. We would then move on to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then Ms. Susan Hoff, International Coordinator, La Strada International. Over to you, Ms. Garlick.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. UNHCR sincerely welcomes the opportunity to take part in this hearing today to benefit from the insights and experience of so many active partners who are committed to work together more effectively to address the devastating phenomenon of trafficking in persons. As the High Commissioner has mentioned, we have the privilege this year, along with UNODC, to co-chair ICAT, the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. ICAT has prepared a submission and recommendations as part of the appraisal of the Global Plan of Action, which will be circulated widely and which we commend to the attention of Member States. Progress made over recent years, since the last review in 2017 and previously in 2013, towards the achievement of the goals of the Global Plan of Action is particularly welcome. In particular, from UNHCR's viewpoint, it is encouraging to see greater recognition of two key linkages to refugee protection. Firstly, the reality that refugees are at heightened risk of exploitation through trafficking. And secondly, that victims of trafficking may be in need of international protection as refugees. To this end, states' recognition that victims of trafficking should not be prosecuted and should not be detained because of their irregular migration status or deported if their status is irregular is crucially important. Further, victims of trafficking should always be guaranteed the right to seek and enjoy asylum where they meet the criteria of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. In doing so, a due account needs to be taken of how their trafficking experience may be relevant to their claims for international protection, as enunciated in UNHCR's Guidelines on International Protection No. 7 on the needs for protection of victims of trafficking. Furthermore, it's important that states give consideration to ensuring that trafficked persons be given residence in countries of arrival, at least on a temporary basis, which is delinked from any participation in criminal proceedings, in order to enable them to recover and rehabilitate. They should be considered for permanent residence and local integration programs on humanitarian or compassionate grounds, where appropriate. In this context, there is a clear need for more work to be done on these fronts. Efforts need to continue, involving states, international organizations, civil society and other partners, to raise the awareness of national immigration authorities, border officials, law enforcement and decision makers in asylum and judicial and other administrative systems to recognize these linkages and to act on them. Training, dialogue, guidance, strengthening of referral systems, research and analysis of state practice and of practical problems confronting them are all crucial ways to reinforce access to protection and rights for victims of trafficking in this domain. At the same time, there is a need to continue to recognise and address the wider challenge of ensuring respect for the human rights of all people on the move, regardless of status, particularly where risks and consequences of trafficking are apparent. We welcome ongoing efforts to support the implementation of the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration and its objectives linked to trafficking, to which UNHCR is actively contributing as part of the UN Migration Network. We look forward to the further dialogue that's going to occur in the panel discussions today and to our collective ongoing work in this crucial area. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all taking part in this important discussion today.
Thank you, Ms. Garlick. Much appreciate the UNHCR's intervention there. We move on to Ms. Susan Hoff. Before I pass the floor on to you, I would like to announce the next three speakers. Ms. Andrea Romoli Garcia, Ambassador and Program Coordinator, Simuka Africa Youth Association and leader of Global Compact for Women's Empowerment Principles by UN Women. Then the distinguished representative of the Republic of Malta, and then Ms. Louise Bonneau, Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer, Missing Child Europe. Ms. Hoff, floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. La Strade International welcomes very much the UN commitment for a strategic and coordinated global approach to address trafficking in human beings and further global action, especially as we are still very much concerned about the remaining gaps in the implementation of anti-trafficking action in Europe and also globally. We note that not all relevant international legal instruments are ratified by states or that not adequately implemented. We see serious gaps in the prevention and prosecution of human trafficking, as well as the identification, protection and support to trafficked persons. We also note still a predominant focus on trafficking for sexual exploitation, and states should equally prioritize all forms of human trafficking by including specific policy measures for all different types of exploitation and its victims. Such policies must be based on a human rights-based approach instead of a criminal justice approach. We see hardly any options for unconditional access to assistance, which really infringes on trafficked persons' rights. Even when identified, trafficked persons are frequently detained, deported, or are prosecuted for crimes which are committed as a direct consequence of their trafficking situation. Non-compliance with the non-punishment provision is therefore another severe gap noticed at the European national level. For effective prevention, it is essential that root causes of human trafficking are effectively addressed, including the structural drivers of exploitation and abuse. While there is currently much ado about addressing demand, measures have so far mainly pointed at the sex industry and been focusing on criminalizing the clients of sex workers, which has really done nothing to address the real causes of human trafficking. Moreover, migration policies mainly focus on promoting return instead of facilitating legal migration. There's an urgent need for attention and protection of all vulnerable workers, in particular migrant workers and those in irregular work or situations. And next to binding legislation on business and human rights, structural information provision, access to legal aid and services, safe reporting and complaint mechanism for all workers is really urgently needed, as well as effective access to compensation and remedies and awareness and outreach. Let me conclude. Identification of victims should not remain a sole responsibility of a single government agency, but should be carried out by multiple disciplinary teams, including civil society organizations, providing services to trafficked persons. In general, the work of civil society should be much better respected by governments, as we note an alarming shrinking space in Europe and globally for civil society. And lastly, we see a lack of possibilities for victims to access temporary or long-term residence and only few possibilities to obtain permanent residence on personal grounds or effective access to asylum procedures. Access to residence and long-term support is essential for trafficked persons' reintegration into society and to prevent re-trafficking. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Hoff, and much appreciation to La Strada International. Ms. Garcia, over to you. Ms. Andrea Romaoli Garcia. Over to you. You have 2.5 minutes. I'm afraid your connection has failed us. Perhaps we can come back to you. May I call on the distinguished delegate, the Republic of Malta, to take the floor?
Thank you, Mr. Getterfield, for giving me the floor. Can you hear me?
We can barely hear you. If you can speak a bit up, if you don't mind, Excellency.
Is it better now?
Yes, much better. Thank you very much.
We welcome today's informal meeting in advance of the upcoming high-level meeting of the General Assembly on the appraisal of the UN Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons. The inclusive, active and substantive engagement of civil society, the private sector and other relevant stakeholders is an important contribution in this process. Malta welcomes the views and experiences of those working directly in responding to trafficking in person and in the humanitarian context. Tragically, human trafficking impacts millions around the world, many ending up trafficked for sexual exploitation, for labor, and some even ending up as child soldiers. The COVID-19 pandemic and its subsequent lockdowns, travel restrictions, and economic impact have put victims of human trafficking, especially women and children, at risk of further exploitation in many circumstances, including in conflict zones, conflict-affected areas, as well as countries of origin, transit, and destinations. Such situations have inevitably contributed to widening the gap with regards to combating trafficking. Malta remains committed to the actions to prevent trafficking as outlined in the Global Plan of Action, including the protection and assistance of victims, prosecution of related crimes, and the strengthening of partnerships among all relevant stakeholders. We also fully agree with the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking that the effective implementation of the principle of non-punishment of victims of trafficking should be safeguarded and included in all appropriate legislation and policies. In 2019, Malta ratified the 2014 Protocol to the 1930 Forced Labour Convention. Last year, Malta also joined the UNODC Blue Heart Campaign, which is an international awareness campaign intended to enhance our global efforts to combat and prevent human trafficking and address its impact on society. Such actions reconfirm our commitment to further provide institutional support towards the promotion of a healthy and positive working environment that is sensitive of and consciously seeking to counter the trafficking of persons. We will continue to raise awareness on this important matter and call on all international partners to continue to work towards the effective implementation of the international obligations we have undertaken. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Much appreciated. Ms. Louise Bonon, following whom I would like to invite in the following order order the Republic of Cuba, and Mr. Richard Opara Diko from Asebe Shehu Yaradua Foundation, Nigeria.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Missing Children Europe is the European Federation of 31 grassroots organizations working on the prevention, protection, and support of missing children cases. I'd like to highlight the following issues and recommendations. First, according to our annual data collection, runaway children constitute the largest category of children going missing. While children in migration are underrepresented, Europol has warned that children in migration and unaccompanied minors are at a higher risk of trafficking and exploitation. Second, our Interact project simulations on transnational cases of children in migration at risk of trafficking and going missing in Europe demonstrated that existing national and international procedures are not always implemented in practice. For example, communications across borders does not happen, trafficking indicators are not always assessed, and when those indicators are detected, investigations on trafficking crimes are seldom launched. It follows that states need to enhance protection systems to reduce the push factors, including by establishing and funding hotlines and helplines, supporting the training of professionals, among others. A cross-border response and coordinated action among national and international stakeholders is also absolutely crucial. Third, we'd like to draw your attention to the risks of online child sexual abuse and exploitation. On a yearly basis, 17 million voluntary reports of child sexual abuse material and grooming are made to the authorities. In 2019, online grooming had tripled on certain social networks, and in 2020, Europol reported a surge of sexual abuse online material due to the COVID-19 crisis. Our members find that online and offline grooming is a growing problem, leading young people to run away and become victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking. Finally, over the last months, the EU had a very significant legal gap. At the end of 2020, the new EU e-privacy law stopped companies from voluntarily detecting and reporting child sexual abuse material online and grooming on their platforms. This led to a 51% decrease in reporting. This legal gap was thankfully closed last Tuesday when the European Parliament approved a law allowing tech companies to voluntarily detect and report these materials and the grooming for the next 3 years. However, the decrease in reporting by tech companies and the very tense debates showed the importance not only of ensuring that privacy laws are developed in line with child rights, but also that all laws regulating the development of technological services which are likely to be accessed by or impact on children, take child rights into account and ensure child safety by design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bonu, and much appreciated the statement from Missing Child Europe. I now turn to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Cuba. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Can you hear me? Well, yes, I beg your pardon, Mr. Moderator. I had my statement prepared in Spanish, but since there is a technical difficulty with the platform, I will have to somewhat improvise a translation into English because we want everyone to hear what we would like to contribute. Mr. Moderator, Cuba maintains its zero-tolerance policy regarding any modality of trafficking in persons. We maintain our cooperation and timely exchange of information with relevant organizations, including Interpol, the UN system, and the competent authorities of other countries, for example, European countries and countries of our region in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also continue implementing the plan of action, the National Plan of Action on Trafficking in Persons, which we understand as a core tool in the common efforts of the state authorities and civil society organizations to ensure the framework and actions of prevention and response to this crime and for the protection of its victims and also other groups of persons who are in particular risk of being victims of this crime, such as people with disabilities, the elderly, young people, children, both boys and girls, and women, of course. However, despite everything that we have done, which is of clear record in the UN system, I would have to make very clear that we cannot accept the recent actions of the U.S. government regarding trafficking in persons in my country. The U.S. government continues to manipulate the issue of trafficking in persons against Cuba in a clear attempt to discredit my country. Recently, the U.S. has included Cuba in a report on trafficking in persons that is elaborated unilaterally and without any international moral authority. The inclusion of Cuba in this report only serves the purposes of political blackmail in the context of the U.S. embargo, the U.S. blockade, I would say, of a commercial, financial, and economic nature. The U.S. lies by accusing Cuba in insufficiently observing the minimal standards for the elimination of trafficking in persons and saying that Cuba does not undertake significant efforts to that end. This fabrication is part of the U.S. campaign to discredit the international cooperation of Cuba in the field of health, for which my country has been praised by many governments, the millions of people it has benefited, in particular in remote areas in developing countries, the UN, the WHO, and other international organizations. Mr. Moderator, in concluding, we reject in the strongest terms this defamatory campaign of the U.S. government against Cuba, and we will continue advancing in our efforts regarding trafficking in persons in full conformity with our national laws and international obligations. The UN family can continue to count on Cuba in promoting the global efforts against trafficking in persons. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, sir. I thank the representative of the Republic of Cuba for his interventions, and much obliged for the fact that you had to do the translation yourself. We are very much indebted. May I turn back to the panel and perhaps check one more time if Ms. Habiba Osman, who was unable to do her intervention earlier, is available now. I'm afraid not. I then would like to give the opportunity to the panel to respond very quickly, any reactions, conclusions, remarks, perhaps for a maximum of 1.5 minutes each, in the same order that we started. Could I call on Ms. Savic?
Thank you for this last minute. I'm very glad that I was here and I listened to these interventions. I can see that we almost 100% agree that this is the violence against women, that it is a social justice issue, not just criminal and security issue, and that we have to enhance this and rebuild trust between different stakeholders. I appreciate and also a few of participants said that the identification process, it should be multi-stakeholder process, practically not just state institutions that are participating in this process, that identify victims, but also civil society organizations, those who are competent and knowledgeable, and those who are working directly with those women and girls at risk. So this is something that will for sure improve identification and access to justice and support to women and girls, millions of women and girls who are now in exploitative situation, not just dozens of thousands that we now have that are identified, and that is what is of a big concern for civil society organizations.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Ms. Vizcara, any final words that you would like to share?
Thank you very much for this last intervention. I would like to highlight certain things that have been said by my colleagues and representatives. This is the moment of multidisciplinarity for communication between sciences, between different actors. The complex nature of trafficking in persons contemporary requires law to start talking with sociology, with anthropology, with science, with psychology. We need multi-actor institutionality. We need the states to be actively speaking with civil society. We need multi-actor to address this issue. We need the conversations between prosecutors and with police. We need them to be complete integral employees in the state. We need a shift in consciousness, and we need a conscience of unity to actually address this issue that puts in danger the basic concept of having human civilization. We are at a crossroads. The pandemic is the last evolutionary red flag, and we need to consider this conscience of unity between all members of humankind.
Thank you very much. Message loud and clear. Ms. McAdam, final minute before we switch off. Over to you. I believe you are on mute. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you, so I will have to leave it there. Before concluding, may I remind everyone that the second panel discussion entitled The Global Plan of Action in Emerging Issues will begin promptly at 3 p.m. The first panel discussion is now concluded. I would like to thank for all the panelists as well as the distinguished representatives who attended. Good day. The meeting is adjourned.